Good morning and welcome to St. Mark's Live. I'm Pastor Adam Thomas. Today is Wednesday, July 1st, 2020. And this is my last Wednesday live stream for about a month because I will be on vacation for a couple of weeks. But today I wanted to finish up what I was talking about last week. I talked about the beginnings of the four accounts of the gospel. And today I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about the ends of the four accounts of the gospel. If you watched last week, you know that we have four different accounts of the gospel in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, there is only one gospel, and that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have four accounts of it, four different perspectives on that gospel, telling generally the same series of events and stories, but from various vantage points. And today I want to talk about the ends of these accounts of the gospel, because just as the beginnings of them showed the different perspectives and ways that the writers were going about approaching the gospel, the ends do a similar thing. All right, so we're just going to dive in. I don't expect this stream to last more than 15-20 minutes, but who knows? I can talk about the end of John for a long time. So once we get to John, I might just go off. We'll see. But here we go. We're going to start with Matthew, because Matthew is the leadoff batter of the New Testament. So let me just jump over to my other screen here. All right, here we are. There's the end of Matthew, Matthew 28. We have the one chapter in Matthew dedicated to the resurrection of Jesus. And I'm not going to talk about the actual resurrection appearance very much. I'm going to jump down to the commissioning of the disciples. But I will say that I'm going to save this resurrection appearance for when we talk about Mark specifically. So just a quick note that we have the women going to the tomb on the first day of the week, and they see the angels, and then they run off, and quickly, with fear and great joy, they run to tell the disciples, and suddenly Jesus met them and said greetings, and they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Hold that in your minds when we get to the Gospel of Mark. All right. I'm just going to jump now down to the end of Matthew. Notice we only have 20 verses of resurrection appearance in Matthew. When we get to Luke and John, you'll see how much more of their accounts of the gospel they spend on the resurrection. These last few verses, though, are very, very important. Now, the 11 disciples, here, we'll just highlight them. That's cool. Oops. All right, go away. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Really wonderful piece of the gospel according to Matthew. And here we have a couple of the themes of Matthew being brought together. We have something happening on a mountaintop, and as Matthew is the gospel that is most concerned with the archetypes of the Hebrew scriptures being seen in the gospel, many things happen, important things happen on the tops of mountains in the Hebrew scriptures. And so for this to happen on top of a mountain is very important, because it shows, again, that connection that we talked about last week. We talked about Moses and Jesus being an archetype of Moses. We have now the disciples coming to Jesus on the mountain, just like Moses went and saw God on the mountain. They some doubted even as they're worshiping, which sort of sounds like now. That's okay. It's okay to doubt. Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Earlier in the gospel, we had the moment where Jesus tells Peter that Peter will be the rock on which Jesus will build the church. So here in Matthew's gospel, we have a little bit of this idea around this structure and how something is going to happen after the story of Jesus is brought out into the world. That there's going to be some sort of, this movement is going to grow from a movement into something more organized. And we can talk later at some other date about whether or not that was a good thing for the church or not. But then he continues, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." We have that Trinitarian formulation there, which is where we get our, when we baptize in the church, we say, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." And then we have this wonderful verse at the very end. This is the one I want to focus on. "And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." I am with you always. This is something that God says quite a bit throughout the Old Testament. But what I want to mention here is this. I am with you always. This is the very end of the gospel. This is how the gospel concludes. If you go back and you look at chapter 1, it's also how the gospel began. This is called in biblical studies an inclusion. Sometimes these happen in shorter stories, but in this instance, it's happening from its bookending the beginning of the account of the gospel and the end of Matthew's gospel. We see, and this is a structure that's used very commonly in the gospel, where we have a similar phrase beginning and ending something so that we know that something is a unit. It's called an inclusion, or you could use the term bookend if you want to. So I'm going to pop back to Matthew chapter 1, and we'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. We talked last week about the genealogy. All right. We don't need ads about women's clothes. We talked about the genealogy. But if we jump down past the genealogy to the birth of Jesus, we have the story of Joseph getting having this dream about taking Mary as his wife and raising Jesus. And if you look right here, we get the words from the prophet Isaiah, and these are important words here. "All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. It's interesting that we're getting the translation of Emmanuel into God is with us. This shows us that Matthew is concerned with making sure his audience knows what the name Emmanuel means. God is with us. So right here at the beginning of the account of Matthew's gospel, we have the concept of Emmanuel, God is with us. And then, again, this is an inclusion. It happens at the beginning and at the end. At the end, we have, "And remember, I am with you always." So when you look at the account, Matthew's gospel, you have it beginning with this idea of God being with us always, and you end it with Jesus saying, "I will be with you always." And everything in between demonstrates this promise that God through Christ is with us always, including the naming of the Holy Spirit, who empowers us to see and be with God even now. So that's enough about Matthew. I just wanted to point that out. I am with you always, being this theme throughout Matthew's gospel that starts at the beginning and goes to the end. All right, let's jump over to Mark now, talking about the ends of the gospel. That's the beginning. We talked about the beginning of Mark last time. Remember, he just jumps right in and goes just sort of at warp speed through the story. Mark 16, here we go. All right. So, Mark 16 is all of 8 verses long. That's the whole thing. That's it. All of it right there. That's the whole thing. Mark 16. We have the story, very similar story in Matthew. where they go to this where the women go to the tomb on the first day of the week. The stone's not there. The young man or angel dressed in a white robe is sitting there. He says, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus. He was raised. He's not here. Go tell the disciples." And then, this is the curious part. Verse 8. "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." That's how the Gospel of Mark ends. You'll notice that there are the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark. I'm not going to talk about those because they were added later. I think that I am of the opinion that Mark ends at verse 8, that these other things that were added later were added because it has such an unsettling end. They fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It seems like a really unsettling end. And it is, in a way, until you realize what Mark is doing. Remember, again, let's pop back to the beginning. Mark 1. In the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I contend that when Mark is saying the beginning of the good news, Mark is talking about his entire account of the gospel, not just these verses at the beginning. He's talking about the whole story is the beginning of the good news. And so when we get to 16 and we see the women running off afraid and not telling anybody, what we have here is the end of the beginning of the good news. And so what Mark is saying to the reader of the gospel is that it is up to you to be the proclaimer of this good news. The women must have told somebody, or else their story wouldn't be in this text. But it's as if Mark ends the gospel before it really ends, in order to say, now you are going to do the middle of the story. I have written the beginning, and now it's your turn to take up the mantle and keep going. And that's why the Gospel of Mark doesn't actually end. It's like a scene in a movie, like the movie Inception, which ends with the top spinning and the screen goes black before you know if the top falls over, and it's up to you to think, oh, did the top fall over or not? I don't know. That's how this gospel ends. It ends a minute before it needs to, or it should. And that's because the gospel doesn't actually end. The way that this ends in this unsettling manner is basically to say, I have now ended the beginning, and it's your turn to take up the mantle to tell the middle of this story. I love that about Mark's gospel. All right, let's continue on to, let's go talk about Luke. Not Lucal. Luke. Alrighty. So here we are. Luke 24. We have the resurrection appearance, again, very similar to Matthew. There are some differences, but similar enough that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Then we have the long story of the road to Emmaus, where Jesus appears to the two, Clopas and his companion, as they're walking along the way, and they recognize him in the breaking of the bread and realize that their hearts knew him as he was talking to them on the road. Then Jesus appears to his disciples. He eats a little bit of fish so they know he's not a ghost. And then they go out to they talk a little bit more. Then he led them out as far as Bethany, which is 2 miles from Jerusalem. Lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven, and they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. All right. So Luke ends with these words. And yet Luke isn't over yet. Luke is part 1 of a 2-part episode. Think of this as like a 2-part episode of television, where part 1 ends to be continued. And then part 2 picks up with a little recap of the way that part 1 ended. Because Luke wrote both the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, what we have here at the end with this narration of the ascension, and Luke is the only gospel account with the ascension narrated, we have this moment of the ascension here, and then it is picked up again in the Acts of the Apostles and narrated a second time, and with more detail. So Acts begins with again a little research methodology about Theophilus, and then we jump right in with the recap of how the gospel ended. So they come together, and Jesus goes up into heaven after giving them their mission to be Jesus' witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so Luke, when we talk about the end of Luke, we're actually talking about the middle of Luke's entire story, the first half of it being about Jesus and the disciples, the second half being about the disciples who are now apostles going out and spreading that message far and wide. And so Luke's gospel is a pivot point. The end of it is a pivot point between the end of Luke and the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. But you can't think of Luke's gospel having an end. It is a to be continued. Alrighty. And finally, let's talk about John. John chapter 20. All right. Now, again, we begin with the resurrection appearance. John's is a little different. Again, there's still women going to the tomb. This one is only Mary Magdalene going to the tomb. And then she has an encounter. She goes back and gets Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. They go and they see the tomb. They go home. Then she stays weeping outside the tomb. Jesus comes and says her name and then sends her to tell the disciples about him. Then he appears to the disciples, receive the Holy Spirit, peace be with you. He has the part with Thomas where he says, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. That is a very kind of a thesis statement in John's gospel, that these words are written, and it's the next line. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the thesis statement, one of the thesis statements of John's gospel right there. And what an amazing way to end the gospel according to John. It really feels like it has a nice closing, similar to, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. It ends so well. Now, Jesus did many other things. They're not written here, but these are written so that you believe, and that through believing you may have life in his name. It's such a great way to end the gospel. Oh, but wait, there's a little arrow here. Wait, is there another chapter? Oh my gosh, there's a whole nother chapter after that? What happened? John ends twice. All right, it's like the Return of the King, the Lord of the Rings movie, the Return of the King, which ends about 7 times, right? The Gospel of John ends twice. It ends at the end of chapter 20, and it ends at the end of chapter 21. Scholars will tell us that it ends twice because chapter 21 might have been tacked on later. Whether or not that's true, it does have these sort of two. It feels like it ends twice. So John 21 also has an ending. So Jesus appears to the disciples again when they're fishing back up in Galilee. They're fishing. He meets them on the beach, tells them to fish on the other side of the boat. Notice that happens in the other accounts of the gospel during the story. In John, it happens during the resurrection appearances. Interesting. They come to the beach. Peter hauls in the net of fish. They have breakfast with Jesus on the beach over a charcoal fire, and then Jesus has the lovely discussion with Peter where he brings Peter back into the community of his believers, asking Peter if he loves him, which gives Peter the opportunity to say, yes, I love you, when earlier Peter had said, no, I'm not part of his group on that scary night of Jesus's arrest and trial. And then we get another ending of the gospel. It's really a ride off into the sunset kind of moment. Jesus tells Peter, after this said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. Scholars will tell us that this is the disciple whose community the Gospel of John was written around. He was the one who reclined next to Jesus at supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Follow me. Follow me." That's important. Jesus' last word in the gospel is follow me. The rumor spreads and so forth. And then verse 24 and 25. This is so interesting. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them down. We know it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. The tradition tells us that's John, although the gospel doesn't actually name that disciple, which I think is important to note. This is the disciple who's testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. Verse 25, listen to this. "But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books or scrolls that would be written." Oh, what a cool ending. It's also the only time in the entire gospel where we have the writer interjecting themselves into the story with this little editorial. I suppose, the writer, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. I like to think that those books are us. That we believe in him and have life in his name, and then we are the continuation of the gospel. That those books are us, our lives of faith, our pathways following Jesus. And I love that, I suppose. But let's look real quick back at this. Jesus' last word in the gospel according to John. Follow me. Follow me. Let's go back and look at the first thing he says in John. Yep-a-dip-a-doo. Yep-a-dip-a-doo. Here we go. "The next day, John was standing and so forth. When Jesus turned and said, 'What are you looking for?'" Oh, man. I thought maybe the first words Jesus said in the Gospel of John were going to be "follow me," and we'd have a nice inclusion. We'd have a nice inclusion like we had with "God is with us and I am with you always" in Matthew. He does say in the next paragraph, he says, he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." So it's pretty close. It's pretty close where we have the "follow me" at the beginning and the "follow me" at the end. But now let's just take a nice look at the entire, because we started with the beginning of Matthew last week and we're ending with the end of John, and that's the four accounts of the gospel in the order that they're placed in the New Testament. Let's just go back and take a look at the beginning of Matthew again. I'm just curious here. Oh, wait, we need to jump forward just a little bit to where Jesus is grown up and can talk. All right. No, not yet. Oh, let's go to 3. Here. Oh, there's John the Baptist with the baptism of Jesus. "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now he's going to go off into the desert and talk to the devil for a little bit. But I want to, here we go. Jesus calls his first disciples. Here it is. Jesus comes back. He goes, gets baptized, goes into the desert, has the whole thing with the devil in the desert, comes back to start his ministry, and that ministry begins at chapter 4, verse 18. "As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, 'Follow me.'" So the very first thing in the gospel, in the order of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus says to Simon Peter is "Follow me." The very last thing in order, if you go all four accounts of the gospel, the very last thing that Jesus says to Peter is "Follow me." Oh, it's so amazing when you look at the whole story. And Jesus says that to us too. Follow me. Follow me. Okay, so that's the end of my look at the quick look at the ends of the 4 accounts of the gospel. I hope that was fun and a little bit enlightening for you. And again, this is the last Wednesday live stream for a couple of weeks because I will be on vacation. We've got our live stream morning prayer service coming up this Sunday, July 5th, 9 a.m., right here on St. Mark's YouTube channel. In the meantime, be well, God bless, and remember those last words of Jesus, also the first words of Jesus, follow me.